The sky burned red as the last light of day bled over the jagged ridges of Gray Canyon. The desert wind carried the sharp tang of dust and smoke, hissing through the brittle sage like a warning. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his ranch, boots sinking into the parched earth, his revolver heavy on his hip. His breath came slow and steady, but his heart pounded like distant thunder. 3 riders had come out of the canyon, their silhouettes sharp against the dying sun. They rode with the confidence of men who believed no one could stop them. Their horses were restless, snorting and pawing at the ground as the riders dismounted. At their head was Silas Crow, a hard, lean man with a scar twisting his upper lip and eyes as black as a crow's wing. He spat into the dirt and thumbed back his coat, just enough to reveal the pearl grip of his Colt. "Hand over the woman and the girls, Cole," Silas growled, his voice low but cutting. "Do that, and maybe we let you keep breathing." Inside the small cabin behind Ethan, 2 little Apache girls clung to their mother's shawl, wide-eyed and trembling. The faint creak of the floorboards told Ethan they were close, probably standing by the door, listening. His hand hovered over his holster, fingers brushing the worn leather. He hadn't planned for this fight. Hell, he hadn't planned for any of it. But the moment he'd brought Marisol and her girls to his ranch, he'd known trouble would come riding. Ethan's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight slightly, boots grinding against the dirt, never breaking Silas's stare. "Turn around, Crow," Ethan said, his voice steady, cold. "Not gonna happen." The last light slipped behind the canyon, and shadows swallowed the land. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The air felt like glass, thin and ready to shatter. Weeks ago, Ethan Cole's life had been nothing but silence and dust. Every morning, he woke to the same sound, the dry, hollow whistle of the canyon winds scraping against the empty plains. The sun would rise over the broken ridges, spill across the parched earth, and set again without anyone noticing, except Ethan. Days blurred into one another like smoke trails on the horizon. He had a small ranch, but calling it a ranch felt like a lie. Half the fencing was down, the cattle long gone, the barn leaning on its last legs. The water trough stood cracked and dry most days, and the well wasn't much better. Still, Ethan stayed. There was nowhere else for him to go. Years back, this had been different. Ethan and his younger brother, Jacob, had built this place together, dreaming of something lasting. A patch of land they could call their own. They'd hauled lumber with their bare hands, mended fences in the cold, and burned their shoulders raw under the summer sun. For a while, the dream had almost seemed real. Then the Randall land dispute came. It had started with rumors that the Randall family, wealthy ranchers from the South, planned to seize every inch of water rights around Gray Canyon. The Cole brothers refused to sell, knowing the land was worthless without water. Threats were exchanged, then warnings, then bullets. One night, fire bloomed on the horizon. By the time Ethan and Jacob reached the barn, the Randall men were waiting. The gunfight lasted less than a minute, but it ended everything. Jacob took a bullet to the chest. Ethan still remembered the way his brother gasped for air, blood soaking into the dirt. He'd held him there, shaking and cursing, until Jacob's hand finally went cold. After that night, Ethan buried his brother under the lone mesquite tree behind the ranch. He marked the grave with an unpolished cross and never visited it again. The law came too late and did too little. The Randalls walked free, protected by money and friends in high places. Ethan was left with a ruined ranch, a crippled future, and a silence so heavy it crushed the breath out of him. That silence became his companion. He stopped going into town. Folks whispered when they saw him, not out of malice, but pity. "That's Ethan Cole," they'd say. "Lost everything. Ain't been the same since." He didn't correct them. He didn't speak much at all. Instead, he filled his days with small, mindless work. Mending fences that didn't need mending, patching roofs that still leaked anyway, oiling a revolver he rarely drew. Nights were worse. That was when the memories came creeping. Jacob's laugh, Jacob's last breath, the gun smoke hanging heavy in the air. Whiskey helped, but only enough to blur the edges. The world had taught Ethan a simple, brutal lesson. Stay out of other folks' business. Keep your head down, keep to your own, and maybe, just maybe, trouble won't find you. For 2 years, that rule worked. He avoided disputes, ignored gossip, and never interfered when others needed help. Once, he'd ridden past a wagon broken down on the edge of the flats. A man cursing and a woman crying softly. Ethan didn't stop. He told himself it wasn't his problem. But trouble, as Ethan was about to learn, doesn't need an invitation. It finds you anyway. Sometimes it comes like lightning, sudden, violent, unavoidable. And sometimes it starts with the smallest thing. For Ethan, it began with 2 tiny figures in the desert, staggering barefoot beneath a merciless sun. He'd been riding back from the northern ridge that day, checking fence lines. It was late afternoon, the heat shimmering off the earth like waves, when he spotted them in the distance, small, dark shapes against the pale sand. At first, he thought they were stray dogs or maybe buzzards circling something dead. But as he rode closer, the shapes took form. 2 little girls. They couldn't have been more than 5, maybe 6 at most, dressed in torn calico skirts and threadbare shirts, their black hair tangled and full of sand. One clutched the other's hand, dragging her along as they stumbled forward, bare feet bleeding where cactus spines had bitten into them. Ethan's first instinct was suspicion. Out here, appearances lied and traps were common. But when he called out, the taller of the 2 turned toward him and he saw her face. Apache by her features, cheeks streaked with dust and tears. The girl's lips cracked as she whispered hoarsely, "Please, don't hurt us." Her sister coughed, gasped, and clung tighter to her arm. "Mama's dying," she managed to say. Something twisted inside Ethan's chest, a weight he hadn't felt in years. He swung down from his horse and crouched low, palms open, keeping his voice soft. "Where's your mama?" he asked. The taller girl pointed to a shallow cave tucked into the redstone cliffs nearby. That's where Ethan found Marisol. She lay curled on the cave floor, her skin pale beneath layers of grime, her breathing shallow and ragged. Fever sweat slicked her face, and her wrists bore angry purple bruises. One look told Ethan the truth. Someone had beaten her, and beaten her bad. He poured a trickle of water from his canteen between her lips, but she barely stirred. The girls knelt beside her, whispering words he didn't understand, their little hands stroking her tangled hair. Ethan hesitated. He knew better than to get involved. Whatever happened here, whoever had done this, wasn't his fight. If he walked away now, no one would fault him. No one would even know. But as he stood there, staring down at the broken woman and the 2 terrified children clinging to her, something old and buried deep inside him stirred. It was Jacob's voice, faint but insistent. "Don't turn your back on folks who need you, Ethan." He swallowed hard, looked out toward the empty horizon, and cursed under his breath. Ethan Cole was a man who'd sworn never to fight another battle that wasn't his. And yet, that day, he picked up Marisol's frail body, carried her to his horse, and lifted the girls up beside her. Somewhere deep down, he knew the moment he did it, this wasn't going to end quietly. Trouble had found him again. Ethan Cole had carried wounded men before. He'd hauled his brother from a burning barn, dragged dying cattle hands from stampedes, even lifted strangers from roadside wrecks. But carrying Marisol felt different. She weighed almost nothing, skin and bone wrapped in torn fabric, her breath so shallow he feared she might slip away before they reached his horse. The 2 girls trailed behind him, clinging to each other, silent except for the soft sobs they couldn't hold back. By the time Ethan set Marisol across the saddle, sweat rolled down his back and soaked his shirt. He turned to the taller girl, crouched low to meet her frightened gaze. "What's your name, little one?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated, darting a glance at her sister before whispering, "Leia." Her voice was raspy, raw from thirst. She rested a hand on the smaller girl's shoulder. "This is Suri." "All right, Leia, Suri," Ethan said softly. "We're headed to my ranch. It's safe there." He paused, hesitating for half a second before adding, "No one's gonna hurt you anymore." Leia's dark eyes searched his face, testing the promise she so desperately needed to believe. After a long moment, she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and allowed him to lift her onto the saddle in front of her mother. Suri followed, her little hands gripping the worn leather horns so tightly her knuckles turned white. As Ethan swung up behind them, his horse shifted uneasily under the extra weight, but he steadied the animal with a firm hand and a low murmur. With a last glance back at the cave, they rode into the fading light. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had slipped behind the jagged teeth of Gray Canyon. Long shadows stretched across the plains, and the air had cooled, but the girls shivered more from exhaustion than cold. Inside the cabin, Ethan cleared his workbench of tools and laid Marisol down on the narrow bed. Her fever was burning high, and shallow tremors shook her frail body. Ethan lit the lantern and pulled his small medicine box from the cupboard, a battered tin case filled with odds and ends he'd kept from his cattle days. Strips of cloth, dried willow bark, an old bottle of laudanum, and a pouch of powdered herbs he'd traded for years back. He crushed the herbs into a paste, spooned cool water into Marisol's mouth, and wiped the sweat from her brow with a damp cloth. She stirred once, whispering something in a language he didn't know, and fell still again. For the next few hours, Ethan worked silently while the girls huddled together near the hearth, eyes wide and unblinking. He fed them spoonfuls of thin porridge and gave them water, but they ate mechanically, their minds elsewhere. When the fever finally broke near dawn, Marisol's breathing steadied. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. The girls had curled up on the rug, their small hands clasped even in sleep. He stared at them for a long moment, something unfamiliar gnawing at him. A mix of relief, fear, and responsibility he hadn't felt in years. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet labor. Ethan mended the broken shutters, drew fresh water, and coaxed Marisol back to strength. He'd always lived alone, used to silence filling every corner of his cabin. But now the air was different. There were soft voices, the patter of little feet, and, for the first time in years, laughter. On the fourth day, Suri chased a grasshopper across the porch, giggling when it leapt from her hand. Ethan froze, mid-swing of his hammer, startled by the sound. He realized then how long it had been since anything pure had touched this place. Marisol recovered slowly, her strength returning one fragile piece at a time. Her wrists were still bruised, her ribs tender from the beating she'd endured, but she could sit upright now, feeding her daughters by the hearth. She spoke softly, rarely meeting Ethan's eyes, but her gratitude was evident in every careful gesture. Ethan didn't ask questions, not at first. He figured if she wanted him to know, she'd tell him. But one evening, as the desert sky bled orange and violet beyond the cabin door, Marisol spoke. "They'll come," she said simply, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan glanced up from the oil lamp he was trimming. "Who?" Marisol's gaze fixed on the horizon, as though she could see through the hills and into the shadows beyond. "My husband's kin, the Crows. They want the land, his father's ranch, the water rights, everything. When he died, they thought I would hand it over. When I refused," her voice faltered, and she touched the fading bruises on her cheek. Ethan frowned, leaning forward in his chair. "Those bruises, they did this?" She nodded once. He sat back slowly, exhaling through his nose. "And you think they'll follow you here?" Marisol finally met his gaze, her dark eyes sharp despite her frailty. "No," she said softly. "I know they will." That night, Ethan lay awake long after the cabin fell silent. Outside, the wind dragged dry whispers through the sagebrush, and a coyote's distant cry echoed off the canyon walls. He stared at the ceiling beams, mind restless. He should have ridden away the moment he'd found them. That's what the old Ethan would have done. The man who swore off other people's battles, who learned the hard way what getting involved cost. But that man was already gone. When dawn crept over the plains, painting the sky pale gold, Ethan was already up, splitting wood and fortifying the cabin. He patched weak spots in the shutters, stacked sandbags near the porch, and checked the rifle he hadn't touched in 2 years. If the Crows came, he intended to be ready. 2 days later, Just as the girls were learning to smile again, Ethan found signs. Boot tracks. Fresh ones. He spotted them near the creek bed a mile from the ranch, 3 sets, deep and deliberate. Whoever they were, they weren't passing through. They'd stopped there, crouched low, maybe even watched the house from a distance. When he returned to the cabin, he didn't tell Marisol. The girls were chasing each other barefoot in the yard, their laughter sharp and bright against the wind, and he couldn't bring himself to crush it just yet. But that night, as he sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, Ethan realized something unsettling. They weren't just running from danger anymore. Danger had already found them, and it was only a matter of time before it came knocking. Ethan Cole had never been a man who sought out trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. After spotting the boot tracks by the creek, he stopped pretending this was temporary. Whoever had come sniffing around hadn't stumbled there by chance. They were watching, waiting, and sooner or later they'd come closer. That morning, he set aside everything else and focused on preparing the ranch. He rebuilt the north fence, not because it needed fixing, but because it gave him an excuse to lay hidden iron spikes in the gaps where riders might come through. He repaired the old cellar door beneath the cabin, clearing it out so Marisol and the twins would have a safe place if bullets started flying. Inside, he stacked jars of dried beans, 2 buckets of water, and a single lantern. When Marisol asked why, he simply said, "Just in case," and left it at that. Days bled into each other as he worked. In the evenings, when the desert cooled and the cicadas started their restless song, Ethan sat with Marisol on the porch while the girls played in the yard. It was a strange kind of peace, fragile as glass. Leia had started talking more, her guardedness giving way to curiosity. One night, she climbed onto Ethan's lap uninvited and asked, "Why do you live here all by yourself?" Ethan hesitated. He could have lied, but the way her dark eyes searched his face left no room for easy answers. "Used to live here with my brother," he said finally. "He's gone now." Leia tilted her head. "Did he go where Mama's husband went?" Marisol's hands stilled where she was braiding Suri's hair, her shoulders tightening ever so slightly. Ethan nodded once, his voice low. "Yeah, he did." For a long while, no one spoke. The girls chased fireflies through the grass, and the air smelled faintly of mesquite smoke from the stove. It should have been peaceful. But peace, Ethan knew, didn't last in these parts. 3 nights later, it broke. It was past midnight when Ethan heard the soft snort of a horse somewhere beyond the yard. His eyes snapped open in the dark. For a moment, he thought he'd dreamed it. The cicadas droning, the wind brushing against the shutters. But then he heard it again. He rolled silently out of bed, grabbed his revolver from the nightstand, and padded barefoot to the window. Moonlight silvered the plains, casting long shadows from the mesquite trees. First, he saw nothing. Then a faint flicker of movement near the fence caught his eye, a rider, sitting stock still in the saddle, watching the cabin from the darkness. Ethan's jaw clenched. He slid the window open just enough to aim, but before he could sight the figure, the rider tugged on his reins and melted back into the night. When he checked the yard at dawn, he found fresh hoofprints leading toward the canyon. Later that day, Marisol confronted him as he loaded extra cartridges into his belt. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked quietly, keeping her voice low so the girls wouldn't overhear. "Tracks near the fence," Ethan admitted. "And a rider last night. Couldn't make out who, but I've got a good guess." Marisol drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Silas Crow," she whispered. Ethan glanced at her. "That's the one." She nodded. "He's the worst of them. My husband's cousin. Greedy. Violent. He won't stop until I'm gone." Ethan strapped his holster tight, his jaw set. "Then he'll have to go through me first." The first confrontation came 2 days later, when 3 riders appeared just after noon. Ethan spotted them from the porch as they crested the southern ridge, sunlight flashing on their rifle barrels. He recognized Silas instantly. Tall, raw-boned, scar across his upper lip like a lightning strike. 2 men flanked him, both Crow-kin by the look of them. They stopped a dozen paces from the porch. Dust hung in the air around their horses. Silas spat into the dirt and leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Afternoon, Cole," he drawled. "I hear you've been playing nurse to my cousin's squaw." Marisol stiffened where she stood just inside the doorway, shielding the girls behind her. Ethan stepped down from the porch, revolver loose in his hand but angled toward the ground. "They're under my protection," Ethan said evenly. Silas's grin was slow and cold. "Ain't your business, Cole. Never was. Now hand 'em over, and maybe we let you keep breathing." Ethan didn't blink. "Not gonna happen." The air between them tightened, brittle as glass ready to shatter. The other two crows shifted in their saddles, hands brushing their holsters. Silas's gaze hardened. "You think you can stand against us?" Ethan finally raised his revolver, steady as stone. "Try me." For a long, dangerous heartbeat, no one moved. Then Silas spat again, wheeled his horse around, and barked, "Come on, boys. This ain't over." They rode off without another word, but the dust they left behind felt like smoke from a fuse burning fast. That evening, Ethan sat cleaning his rifle by lantern light when Marisol joined him. "They won't stop," she said softly, watching his hands work. "I know. They'll come back with more men. I know that too." She hesitated, her voice trembling just enough to betray the fear she kept buried. "You could still walk away, Ethan. This isn't your fight." Ethan paused, fingers tightening around the oiled rag. He thought of Jacob, of blood in the dirt, of lawmen who never came. Then he looked at the two girls curled up by the hearth, their small faces finally at peace. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it is now." Over the next week, Ethan transformed his modest ranch into a fortress. He reinforced the shutters with iron plates, dug firing trenches behind the barn, and hid 2 spare rifles in the loft. At night, he taught Marisol how to shoot. Her hands shook the first time she held the revolver, but she listened carefully, absorbing every word. By the 3rd night, her aim was true enough to shatter a bottle at 30 paces. Leia and Suri stayed close, sensing the tension even if they didn't fully understand it. Suri clung to Marisol's skirts, while Leia followed Ethan everywhere, watching him set traps and test rifle sights. One evening, she tugged at his sleeve. "Are the bad men coming soon?" Ethan crouched down to her level, resting a rough hand gently on her small shoulder. "Yeah," he admitted softly, "but they won't get past me." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded with quiet certainty. "Good, 'cause Mama says you're the strongest man in the world." Ethan swallowed hard, fighting the weight in his chest. He wasn't strong. Not really. But for them, he'd have to be. The crows were coming. He could feel it in the silence of the plains, in the way birds no longer nested near the creek, in the restless twitch of his horse's ears at night. Every sunset painted the horizon blood red, as if warning what was to come. And Ethan Cole, a man who'd sworn never to fight another man's war, found himself loading rifles by lantern light, waiting for a battle he knew he might not survive. Trouble wasn't on the horizon anymore. It was at his door. The crows didn't come back the next day, or the next, but Ethan Cole wasn't fooled. Out here, silence wasn't peace. It was the warning before a storm. He spent his mornings patrolling the edges of his land, eyes scanning the hills for riders, and his evenings cleaning rifles by lantern light. Every creak of a shutter, every coyote howl beyond the ridge set his hand twitching toward his holster. Marisol saw it too. She moved quietly around the cabin, always keeping the girls close, her gaze often fixed on the horizon. At night, she would sit with Ethan on the porch, shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and they would listen to the desert winds dragging whispers through the dry sage. "You think they're gathering men?" she said one evening. "I'd bet on it." Marisol nodded slowly, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "Silas won't forgive you for standing against him." Ethan glanced at her, jaw tightening. "Let him try." 2 days later, Ethan spotted smoke rising from the southern flats. By the time he reached the ridge, his stomach turned cold. A neighbor's barn, old Walter Briggs's place, was a blackened skeleton collapsing under its own weight. The crows had sent a message. When Ethan found Briggs standing among the ashes, the man's face was gray, his hat clutched tight in his hands. "They come in the night," Briggs rasped. "Didn't even give me a chance. Said next time I let you shelter what don't belong to you, they'll burn more in my barn." Ethan gripped his reins, his knuckles pale against the leather. The crows weren't just threatening him anymore. They were putting the whole valley on edge. By the time he rode back to his ranch, word had spread like wildfire through the settlements. Some folks kept their distance, afraid to get caught in the crossfire. Others, like Briggs, stopped answering their doors when Ethan rode past. The crows had money, numbers, and a reputation. Ethan? He had a leaky cabin, one rifle, and a promise he wasn't willing to break. That night, someone tried to poison the well. Ethan found the dead jackrabbit floating in the bucket at dawn, its bloated body stinking in the heat. He spent hours hauling water from a distant spring, burning his shoulders under the sun, while Marisol kept the girls inside. "You should leave," she told him that evening as he scrubbed the rifle parts clean. "Take your horse and go north, before it's too late." Ethan shook his head, voice flat. "Ain't leaving you here." Marisol looked at him for a long time, her dark eyes shining faintly in the lamplight. Finally, she said, "Then none of us will survive." 2 nights later, he heard footsteps on the porch. He rose silently from his bed, revolver in hand, and moved to the window. A shadow slipped across the boards, stopping by the door. Ethan's heart slowed, his breathing deep and steady. He eased the latch open just enough to see. A man crouched by the doorframe, striking a match. In the flare of orange light, Ethan caught the glint of a whiskey bottle stuffed with rag. A firebomb. Ethan kicked the door open, the edge slamming into the man's ribs. The bottle slipped from his grasp and shattered against the porch, flames licking briefly at the boards before dying in the dirt. The man scrambled to his feet, clutching his side. Ethan recognized him, one of Silas Crow's cousins. "You tell Silas?" Ethan growled, shoving the barrel of his Colt into the man's chest. "Next time he sends someone to burn my home, I won't miss." The man spat blood, sneering. "You're a dead man, Cole." "Maybe," Ethan said coldly, "but you'll get there first." He let the man run, watching him vanish into the darkness. By dawn, Ethan knew this wasn't going to end with threats. The crows had crossed the line. For the next 3 days, he fortified the ranch like a man preparing for war. He dragged heavy timbers across the south entrance, rigged wire snares near the creek, and cut shallow trenches beneath the porch for cover fire. Marisol practiced with the rifle until her aim was steady and sure. The girls helped in their own small ways, carrying buckets, fetching nails, and handing Ethan cartridges with solemn determination. It should have felt hopeless, 3 people, alone on a dying ranch, against the crows and whoever they'd bought with whiskey and silver. But something inside Ethan had shifted. For years, he'd lived like a ghost, convinced he had nothing left worth fighting for. Now, looking at Leia and Suri huddled together in the loft, whispering secrets to each other by lamplight, he felt something stir deep inside him. Something he thought Jacob had taken to the grave. He had a purpose again, and he'd kill to keep it. The storm broke at noon 3 days later. Ethan was fixing the barn roof when he heard the distant thunder of hooves. At first, he thought it was a dust storm rolling down the canyon, but then he saw them crest the southern ridge. 10 riders in a ragged line, rifles flashing in the sun. At their head rode Silas Crow. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the man's grin. It wasn't joy. It was hunger, the kind a predator wears when it knows its prey is cornered. Marisol came running from the cabin, her shawl trailing behind her, eyes wide with fear. "They've brought more men," she gasped. Ethan grabbed her shoulders, steadying her. "Get the girls into the cellar. Take water, food, the lantern. Stay quiet until I come." Marisol hesitated, her voice breaking. "Ethan, go," he said sharply. "Now." She nodded once and disappeared into the cabin. Ethan stood alone in the yard as the riders drew closer, his rifle resting against his shoulder. Dust rose around their horses like smoke, blurring the horizon into a haze of gold and shadow. When the crows finally reined in their mounts 20 paces from the porch, the air between them felt heavy, electric. Silas leaned forward, resting one elbow lazily on the saddle horn. "Last chance, Cole," he called, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Give us the woman and them girls, and you walk away breathin'." Ethan's voice was steady, though his blood thundered in his ears. "Not today." Silas's grin widened. "Feral. Then I reckon we'll bury you right where you stand." Behind him, 10 rifles glinted in the sun. Ethan lowered his gaze, thumb brushing the worn edge of his revolver's grip. If this was how it ended, he'd make damn sure the crows remembered his name. The world went still. Ethan Cole stood alone in the yard, a single man facing 10 armed riders. The dry wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the faint rattle of distant cicadas. Somewhere, a hawk screeched high above the canyon, as if mocking the silence below. Inside the cabin, the trapdoor to the cellar creaked shut. He knew Marisol had the girls hidden, crouched together in the dim lantern light. He prayed they couldn't hear his heartbeat pounding like war drums in the quiet. Silas Crow rested one hand lazily on his saddle horn, his grin sharp and cruel. "Last chance, Cole," he called, voice steady, too calm. "You give me Marisol and them girls, we leave this ranch standing. You keep playin' hero, and all folks'll find of you's bones in the dirt." Ethan spat into the dust and shifted his rifle into both hands. "You came for blood, Silas," he said quietly. "You'll bleed first." A murmur rippled through the crow riders, a low hum of men adjusting their grips, loosening reins, preparing for violence. Sunlight flashed on steel. Silas tilted his head, amused. "You talk like a man ready to die." "Been ready for a long time," Ethan said flatly. "Difference is, I aim to take you with me." That broke the grin. Silas's jaw tightened. He jerked his chin. "Boys!" The first rifle cracked, splitting the silence like a whip. Ethan dropped to one knee, rolled behind a barrel, and fired back in the same motion. His first shot tore a chunk of wood from the nearest rider's saddle. The second sent the man tumbling to the ground, clutching his leg. The yard exploded into chaos. Bullets punched splinters out of the porch posts, shattered a lantern on the wall, and ricocheted off the iron-plated shutters Ethan had reinforced days before. The crows fanned out, trying to circle him, but the traps Ethan had laid, hidden wire snares stretched across the south entrance, caught 2 riders off guard. Their horses screamed, collapsing as the men were flung hard into the dirt. Ethan moved fast, always in motion, ducking from cover to cover. He counted his shots, breathing slow, steady, deliberate. For every bullet he fired, he whispered Jacob's name under his breath like a prayer. "Smoke him out," Silas roared. One of the crows hurled a flaming whiskey bottle onto the porch, but Ethan kicked it back mid-roll, glass shattering harmlessly against the dirt. From inside the cabin, Marisol appeared briefly at the window, rifle braced against her shoulder. Her shot rang out clean. One rider fell backward, screaming, his weapon tumbling into the dust. "Back inside," Ethan shouted without looking. She obeyed, vanishing from sight as another bullet struck the wall where she'd stood seconds before. The crows regrouped, their numbers still overwhelming. 5 left uninjured, plus Silas, who hung back behind a mesquite tree, orchestrating every move. Ethan's lungs burned, his revolver hot in his hand. He'd only bought them minutes, maybe less. Then the sound came, faint at first, almost like the wind itself, a strange rhythm of hooves on stone. Silas's men hesitated, hearing it too. From the jagged ridge above the ranch, war cries shattered the canyon air. Figures burst from the rocks, swift, silent shadows descending like a storm. Apache warriors, their bows drawn, rifles flashing, arrows hissing through the air. For a split second, Ethan thought he'd imagined them. But then one arrow buried itself in the chest of a crow rider, dropping him before he could fire. Another rider screamed as his horse went down, arrows thudding into the dirt around him. Silas spun in his saddle, cursing. What the hell? The crows tried to scatter, but the narrow flats trapped them. The Apaches moved with deadly precision, their shots whistling past Ethan as if he weren't there. A warrior in war paint swept past him on horseback, rifle raised, shouting something Ethan didn't understand. He caught Marisol's voice from the cellar steps. She called a single name, and the warrior's head snapped toward her. It hit Ethan then, these weren't strangers. They were Marisol's people. Somewhere, somehow, they'd been following her trail since the day she vanished into the desert. The fight turned fast and brutal. Ethan picked off 2 more Crow men while the Apache warriors harried the flanks, driving them toward the canyon edge. Horses screamed. Men cursed and fired wildly, dust choking the air until it stung Ethan's throat raw. Through the haze, he spotted Silas dismounting, crouched behind a rock, rifle leveled. The bastard wasn't running. He was hunting. Ethan circled wide, moving low through the sage. He could hear his own breath, ragged and shallow, every step crunching softly on the gravel. Then he saw Silas's shadow shift, just enough warning. The rifle cracked. The shot tore through Ethan's sleeve, burning hot across his upper arm. He dropped behind a boulder, teeth clenched against the sting. "Come on out, Cole." Silas's voice carried over the gunfire. "Ain't no one left to save you now." Ethan checked his revolver. 2 rounds left. "Funny," he muttered under his breath. "Was just thinkin' the same about you." He moved fast, circling to Silas's blind side. Dust stung his eyes, and sweat slicked his grip, but his aim was steady. When Silas leaned out to fire again, Ethan stood, sights lined up, and squeezed the trigger. The shot caught Silas high in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He staggered, dropping his rifle, and Ethan closed the distance, tackling him hard into the dirt. They hit the ground rolling, fists and knees smashing into ribs, boots kicking up dry earth. Silas clawed for his knife, but Ethan slammed his forearm against the man's throat, pinning him down. "You should have stayed off my land," Ethan growled. Silas spat blood, snarling. "This ain't over." Ethan's revolver silenced him. When the dust settled, the yard was littered with bodies and splintered wood. The last of the Crow riders fled into the distance, chased by Apache arrows until they vanished over the ridge. Ethan stood in the stillness, chest heaving, blood seeping warm down his arm. Marisol emerged from the cellar with the girls clinging to her skirts. She looked at him, at the Apache warriors gathering silently around her, and for the first time since he'd found her in the desert, her eyes filled with tears. One of the warriors stepped forward, speaking softly in their tongue. Marisol replied, her voice trembling but strong. Ethan didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. He knew what they meant. It was over. The feud had ended in blood and dust. That night, under a sky blazing with stars, Ethan sat by the fire cleaning his rifle. His arm throbbed where the bullet grazed him, but the pain was distant, dulled by exhaustion and something heavier, relief. Across the fire, Leia and Suri curled together beneath a blanket, fast asleep, their small breaths steady and soft. Marisol sat nearby, silent but close, her shawl wrapped tight. Ethan stared into the flames, listening to the distant calls of coyotes over the canyon, and thought of Jacob, of promises unkept, of battles fought and lost. This time, though, he'd won. And for the first time in years, he wasn't fighting just for himself. The desert was still. Weeks had passed since the last gunshot. The scorched earth around the Briggs barn had faded to brown, wind carrying dust and the faint scent of ash across the plains. Birds cautiously returned to the mesquite trees, their soft calls threading through the early morning. The sun rose slow and gentle, casting long golden rays that glinted off the worn timbers of Ethan's cabin. Inside, life had begun to settle into a fragile rhythm. Marisol and her daughters moved through the cabin with careful ease, learning the quiet ways of the ranch, the routines Ethan had followed for years. Leia had taken to helping fetch water from the spring, balancing the pail carefully in her small hands. Suri followed her everywhere, whispering questions and giggling whenever a rabbit darted across the yard. Their laughter was small, but in the vast emptiness of the desert, it rang loud and clear, a sound Ethan had not heard in years. Marisol spent her mornings in the garden, tending to a few hardy herbs Ethan had taught her to grow. She placed marigolds near the window and sage along the porch, her hands gentle yet precise, each movement deliberate. She no longer flinched at shadows, nor did her eyes dart constantly to the horizon. She had learned slowly that the danger had passed. Ethan watched all of it from the porch, rifle laid aside, boots dusty and worn from work in the yard. His arm still throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but the pain was a dull reminder, nothing more. More importantly, he noticed the girls. Leia, braver now, climbed atop the low fence and called to him with a triumphant grin. "Look, Ethan, I can jump." Before he could warn her, she leapt, landing awkwardly but upright. Suri clapped her hands in delight. Ethan exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders, and laughed, a sound he hadn't made in months. Evenings were quiet, settled into the soft rhythm of firelight and wind. Ethan built small bonfires near the cabin, teaching the girls to safely tend them. Marisol would sit beside him, shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching the flames dance. She no longer avoided his gaze, no longer flinched when his shadow fell across her path. One night, the girls were asleep inside. Ethan and Marisol sat on the porch steps, their hands brushing occasionally, the warmth of the fire spilling over them. "You saved us," Marisol whispered, her voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. Ethan shook his head, staring at the horizon. "No," he said quietly. "You saved me." She turned to him, eyes glistening in the firelight. "I don't understand." "You lived," he said, voice rough with emotion. "They're alive. That's enough. I didn't do it for me. I did it because I couldn't leave you out there." She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. For the first time, they shared a silence without fear, without the shadow of the crows looming over them. The desert, vast and unforgiving, felt smaller somehow, contained, almost protective. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself teaching the girls more than survival. He showed them how to ride, how to read the horizon for storm clouds, how to track rabbits without startling them. He watched as Leia laughed freely when she tumbled from her horse, and as Suri practiced shooting with the small rifle Ethan had allowed her to hold, always under Marisol's careful supervision. Marisol began to speak of the future, of planting more crops, of perhaps building a small fence to keep livestock nearby. She didn't mention returning to her family, or the crows, and Ethan did not ask. Their past existed like a shadow at the edge of the canyon, present but distant, threatening only if someone dared approach. For Ethan, it was a world he hadn't thought he could inhabit again, one filled with laughter, trust, and a strange sense of belonging. He spent mornings repairing fences, afternoons hauling water, and evenings sitting by the fire, rifle forgotten, letting the wind brush against his face. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a reminder of both danger and freedom. Here, in this fragile pocket of safety, they could breathe. One night, as the stars ignited the sky with cold fire, Marisol leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you ever wonder what will happen if they come back?" she asked softly, voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Ethan tightened his arm around her. "If they do," he said, "we'll be ready. But they won't. Not now." The girls stirred inside the cabin, murmuring in their sleep. Leia called out softly, "Mama?" And Suri's small hand found her sister's. Their breaths, deep and even, were the rhythm Ethan had fought for, the sound of life winning over death. Beyond the walls of the cabin, the desert lay vast and silent. But inside, a new world was growing, delicate, fragile, yet defiant. Marisol lifted her head, eyes reflecting the firelight, and whispered again, "You saved me." Ethan's gaze lifted to the stars above. The wind carried the faint scent of sage, dust, and distant flowers. He did not speak. Words felt unnecessary. The world had taught him how to survive. The girls and Marisol were teaching him how to live. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt that perhaps he could. They stayed there as night deepened, the fire low, the desert quiet. Leia and Suri dreamed of faraway places, of safety, of laughter. Marisol dreamed of peace, and Ethan dreamed of a life he hadn't dared hope for until now. The desert outside remained untamed, wild, and unpredictable. But inside the cabin, they had carved a sanctuary. The feud was over, the crows vanquished, and the echo of danger had faded like a storm retreating over the ridges. Ethan wrapped his arm around Marisol, feeling the soft rise and fall of her breath. He could hear the quiet stirrings of the girls inside, their tiny world safe. And in that moment, under the endless expanse of stars, he understood. Life would go on. Not without scars, not without vigilance. But they would go on. And for the first time, he welcomed it. The desert had been cruel, unforgiving, and relentless. But here, in this small pocket of dust and stone, laughter and life had returned. Ethan Cole was no longer alone. He never would be again.